Okay.
So where should we start?
Well, good question. I mean, I'm sort of, how can I put it? I've that tweet was sort of slightly not quite shit posting, but
Mhm.
let's say phrased in a moderately provocative way, uh, uh, quite deliberately. Well, it just seemed funny,
Mhm.
um, and
I wasn't offended by this panpsychism hate, if that's what you're worried about, by the way. I'm,
no, it's not quite. I didn't feel it was quite offensive, but it was sort of a bit of a dig. Let's.
mhm,
I'll accept that.
mhm,
But I don't. But I don't mean any animosity there. I'm just sort of having
mhm,
fun with it.
mhm.
It just struck me that
Yeah.
it's there's sort of a so and the other thing I guess I would start with is like I'm totally not an expert here. Like I
Mhm.
haven't done the required reading. Like if
Yeah. I've
uh,
done little of it myself.
mm, I've sort of thought about the problem for a
Mhm,
while, for a long time, but never really
mhm.
given it any
Yeah.
particular
Mhm,
study.
mhm,
So that's kind of where I'm starting. So
mhm.
the main thing then is sort of is I'm curious. What's your sort of, because you said you subscribe to something like
Mhm. Yeah.
panpsychism, perhaps. Maybe you
Mhm.
could go into more depth on that.
Yeah. So one thing I've thought of since that exchange and most of it's become clear right now is it's entirely possible. I completely agree that like panpsychism is luminiferous ether theory, um, in that and that it's entirely possible that in this analogy, like the thing I subscribe to is something closer to like the Maxwell's equations of light, of doing away with the bit where you have to assume that the ether exists. Um, so my view is, of course, that everything is like made out of like psychic mystical energy that pervades the. This is not my view. Um,
It's all quantum magic.
um, so my view is essentially that like consciousness is a process, not a thing, and essentially everything you participates in consciousness in the sense that like you cannot cleanly separate the boundary of a well-defined conscious entity, that there is like one entity here and this is the conscious bit, and um, nothing smaller than it is like conscious in its own right, and nothing uh, and its consciousness is completely separate from um, the thing that it contains. I think that like um, us having a conversation is a form of extended consciousness in which we are each using the other person as part of our thinking process. And it's not that there is no well-defined boundary between us. It's that the consciousness that is going on like meaningfully includes both of us in a way that is not best modeled by like two completely discrete conscious entities that are just like sending messages at each other.
Hmm. And let's see. So
I can
okay, so
elaborate and defend any particular bit you'd like me to, by the way. That's just like the elevator pitch version.
yeah, I'm kind of I want to sort of go deeper on some of
Mhm,
that. Um, so, but I'm trying to figure out what the entry point is.
mhm,
Um, so okay, we've talked about parts work, and I
mhm,
think we're sort of, yeah. I don't think either of us would say, well, that person is very simply one consciousness.
mhm.
Like
Yeah.
the that would just seem like, I guess I would admit that as a possibility, but it wouldn't be my default
Mhm.
hypothesis because of things like, what happens when,
Mhm.
um, you divide someone's brain and the
Mhm.
two parts start acting independently. Like,
Yeah.
and so I'm not quite sure sort of which bits, I can point to
Mhm.
which bits exactly in a person I would say are conscious,
Mhm.
um, but I wouldn't sort of assume that there's one specific bit inside the person that was conscious.
Mhm.
Um, but the question about whether the two of us are having sort of at what point it becomes useful to talk about, or I don't know whether useful is the right way of thinking about it, realistic, to talk about the two of us having sharing some aspect of the consciousness as we talk. Like,
If it would be
is
helpful, I have some simple examples I can talk through, but I'm also happy to wait for you to.
No, go for some simple examples or
So I
complex
probably,
examples.
yeah, I started with like the slightly too hard example of like group consciousness. But I think a easier example is one of extended consciousness. Um, but actually, let's just quickly talk about parts work. It's like if we sort of imagine like a person is constituted of like multiple parts that are reasonably interpretable of conscious in their own right, but like the whole person is conscious too, right? So there is sort of like a divisible conscious entity where like um, the whole thing can be regarded as conscious, but also parts of it can be regarded as conscious, like at least
Hmm.
plausibly so. Um,
It's a good question. You see, I'm sort of wondering now. I mean, if you
mhm,
have a bubble
mhm,
and you have another bubble and they join, at some point, they might, that part in
mhm,
between them might open up and then you have like a single
mhm,
bigger bubble.
mhm.
And I'm not quite sure whether I should be thinking about it like that or whether I should be thinking about it like, well, even when that happens, there's still something that you might usefully talk about as sort of, both
Mhm.
pre-existing parts. That's a question about consciousness I don't think that I know an answer to.
That's fair. Um, and yeah, one of the difficulties of talking about this in like a brain's context is that consciousness potentially means two different things in our brain context. And like, um, so conscious thought, I think we often tend to associate with like verbal thought, with sort of like the bit that feels like the I, um, I, the letter, not or the self, not the bit that are
Yeah.
literally eyes. Um, and so if we if we think of like that as the conscious bit, then I think like it's much more plausible to me that actually there is just like a single consciousness this bit, and it's just like you can just point at the bit in the brain. It's just like there, that's the conscious bit. Um, but if we think of consciousness as more like having qualia, like the is there like with the what is it like to be a bat question? Like if a bat is conscious, then um, bits of the bat that or then like consciousness is non can be nonverbal, right? Like there's and it's possible like the bat has a similarly well-defined eye that isn't it's not be verbal, like certainly I think maybe the verbal bit is a red herring, actually. I think I've over anchored on that in explaining this bit.
I think it might be because I think that I might, like if I were thinking about, yeah, it's really easy to say, okay, it's the verbal bit because,
Yeah.
I think both you and I are quite verbal thinkers.
Yeah.
But I would be inclined to say that something was conscious. So I guess, what am I talking about when I say that something is conscious? I'm
Yeah.
not going to say that I have a definitive answer to this question. I have some intuitions that might be quite badly formed. But I think that the intuition is something like can reflect on itself and its internal states. And that's what that means in terms of qualia is actually an interesting question. I think I'm not fully convinced by qualia.
Yeah, I think qualia has almost more of a luminiferous ether quality to it than panpsychism. It's like, I think the thinking of it more as like, what is it like to be this thing? Which maybe itself doesn't have a good answer. So the reason I'm doing this like hair splitting of what do we mean by consciousness, other than that, like literally the title of this conversation is the hard problem of consciousness, which is that, is I wonder if there are a lot of parts of like the mind that you might reasonably label subconscious that we should be thinking of as conscious. Like if like there's all sorts of things going on in the back of your mind. Like if I'm thinking through a mathematics proof, then and go for a walk, and at some point in the walk, I'm just like, aha, I need to construct that feature. Like something in my brain has been doing that, and like I didn't have conscious access to it, but it's clearly like doing enough thinking that it can do mathematics. And so I think at the very least, like the brain is highly modular in a way that I wouldn't want to say, like, I wouldn't want to say that the modules weren't conscious, even if like the way I experience them is like erratically conscious at best.
I wouldn't want to say that they weren't conscious, but I also would be very wary of assuming that they were conscious.
Yeah, I think my strongest claim is that they do something that certainly like acts like a consciousness a bit.
Can I nitpick there
Sure.
and say they do something that acts like an intelligence
Yeah, that's right.
entity? I wouldn't like, the coming up with a solution to a problem on a walk kind of thing. Sure, it happens. Sure, there's a lot going on. And there are, there are some parts of that I might be sort of unsurprised to find were conscious if if someone could demonstrate it to me somehow. Like, for example, I mean, if you think about what comes up during dreams, and you come up with some weird representation of something that's, a big problem for you, and it's like, what the hell came up with that? But that thing, it seems like that part of me was, okay, I said being able to reflect on yourself. That part of me is, it looks like, is reflecting on myself and my life in some way, without me, the conscious bit of me, having access to it until it sort of suddenly emerges in this weird dream. But then there's something like solving say a mathematical or a programming or whatever kind of problem. That hasn't done anything where I would say, ooh, that's reflected on itself. It's reflected on something, it's reflected on the problem because it's come up with a solution to it. But I wouldn't say that it's reflected on itself necessarily.
So I don't know that minds reflect on themselves. I think I think like under the modular view of a mind, which is I don't know how right this is, but like I think if you like when you're doing parts work, for example, but like what you're doing is you are like one part of your mind is looking at another. So I think like a reasonably plausible, and I don't think, and I think like not something I've just made up right now. Honest view of the mind is like it's divided into modules that can reflect on each other. So it's more that like any part of your mind can ask the bits that it's in contact with what they're doing than it is like they can look at their own parts and say, hey, this is what I'm doing. And so like I think and I like the book The Enigma of Reason, which essentially argues that um, uh, reason is a social process, but like it has a whole bunch of interesting things on modularity of thought in there, and like it argues that a lot of what we are doing when we are accessing an intuition or something like that is going and finding the relevant module of our brain and basically saying, "Hey, what's up?" And and so like I think thinking of minds as components that can inspect each other but not themselves is at least pretty plausible to me. Um, and like
Let's run with that for a moment.
okay.
If that were so, then we could expand that out to what you were saying earlier about the two of us having a conversation, like, and it would be more like, well, I'm reflecting on you and you're reflecting on me. I mean, I think I'm also some parts of what you would consider me. You're also reflecting on each other at the very least, but it would make that, it would sort of make sense of that part of your claim that that we would be doing the same thing that you're saying that the parts of the brain are, or parts of the mind are doing.
Yeah, precisely so.
Okay, cool. I can't help but feel that the baby has been thrown out with the bathwater there somewhere. Because like, if it were just parts reflecting on each other, maybe I'm getting too caught up in, say, the sort of linguistic I problem. But it would seem like if we were all just parts reflecting on each other, we would lose the bit, for example, where we get to say things like, I have privileged access to me. And also things like, you know, to whatever extent we believe in qualia, saying, I experience this qualia. I mean, in that case, it would be something more like, some part of me is reflecting on some other part of me that's having the qualia or something like that.
Mhm. Yeah, hang on, let me just replay that. But yeah, so I mean, I don't think the thing that you and I are doing when we talk is identical to the thing that I do when like one part of my mind looks at another part of my mind. I think
Mm.
that at the very least there are different communication channels going on there, and different communication channels like vastly shape the experience. Um, like and this is part of what I mean by consciousness as a process. I think like consciousness is the thing that I'm doing with myself, and then we're doing together, and you're doing with yourself. And I think on the qualia front, I think my answer to the problem of group qualia is that there are many things that's like to be the group Colin and David, but like one of them is experience is like my version of the qualia, and another one is your version of the qualia. Like they're like a group consciousness has multiple perspectives, but I think that is not necessarily different from the consciousness of a brain. Like a split brain person will also have multiple perspectives, and like I think they have a different sort of privileged access, and like not a complete split as well. Um, and so I think the problem of multiple sources of qualia in a group consciousness is not necessarily a particularly major one. Um, but um,
Would you be able to delimit some of the things that would be sort of limit, the boundaries of what you would consider conscious?
mhm. um,
Or I mean, I'm talking to you as the panpsychist here.
mhm.
You don't get to have any of those boundaries, but
Yeah, yeah. So I think the such boundaries don't exist. In that I legitimately believe that everything we have access to participates in consciousness by virtue of the fact that we have access to it. Um, but how useful some component of like the universe is to consider as conscious is highly variable. But so to give an example, like tool use, if I am the hammer is the classic example of like if I'm using a hammer, the hammer is feels like if I'm using it well, the hammer feels like an extension of me. Um, so like to the degree that I am conscious of myself, like myself is equally inclusive of like the hammer. It is an extension, and so I am acting as the hammer as much as I am using as much as I'm acting on the hammer. So, um, and I think this extends to cognitive tasks as well. Like if I'm programming or using a calculator or writing with pen and paper, like I'm engaging in a conscious experience which actively involves um, the thing I'm using as part of my thought process. And um, I wonder if it's useful to like more draw more heavily on like the distinction that you were making earlier between intelligence and consciousness, um, which is when I'm using a cognitive tool, I feel like I'm unambiguously creating an entity that is larger than myself and has an intelligence that I cannot do on my own, right? Like I can solve problems with pen and paper that I can never solve in my head. I can do um, uh, I can do calculations that I can't that sort of thing. Like there is more intelligence there than there is just inside my head, and that intelligence is usefully extended. Um, and like there's nothing stopping that extended intelligence by being provided by other people, right? Like there's a great paper by Nigel Cross, which is nothing to do with consciousness at all. It's about architecture and software assisted computer aided design. But they do it's called canon machine design, and they do an experiment where essentially like they get people to cosplay as computers because it was too hard to write the software. So like they talk to each other via a CCTV camera where like one person sort of gives computer instructions to the other, and then they do the computation. Blurring. quotes go away, but and pass the answer back. And so like this is an example where I'm constructing an extended intelligence in the way that I would with a computer, but with another conscious entity is like included in the intelligence. So like intelligence very much is distributed and extends into the world. And then, but the only, and we can see intelligence in the behavior of other things, and this is often like the only basis we have for concluding that they're conscious, right? Um, like, like you can tell me you're conscious, and I have a certain amount of ethical duty to believe you. Like solipsism isn't a good look, but like I also assume the aforementioned bat is conscious, right? Like it, like.
Right. So here's where I think I'm going to differ with you, because I actually make quite a severe distinction between intelligence and consciousness. And so when I see an intelligent thing, I might be highly impressed with its intelligence without thinking for a moment that it's conscious. And things like AlphaGo are things that I include in that.
Yeah.
Like.
Yeah, sorry, no, I don't think AlphaGo is conscious in. I mean, I do think AlphaGo is conscious because I think everything participates in consciousness. But like, I don't think AlphaGo is a primary seat of consciousness, to coin a term which I probably don't endorse.
And so when it comes to the bat, it's not on account of the bat's intelligence that I assume that it's conscious, but actually more like, I mean, frankly, I don't know very much about bats. I'm not an expert on bats, but they are mammals. And
if you think of them as a mouse with wings, you're not far off.
Yeah. And like, I don't know a whole lot about mice either, but I know a bit about, say, cats. And cats are like clearly without being verbal, or not terribly, a little bit verbal, but not very verbal. You can totally observe behavior that really is consistent with quite a lot of thought, quite a lot of self-reflective thought. Cats can take offense at things. They can be, I mean, I'm sort of putting my thumb on the scales with the word here, but self-conscious. I mean, they're, you know, they have things that they're private about. They don't want you to see them doing, and all sorts of things like that. And so I think the reason that I'm going to say, well, that's probably a conscious creature in some respect, is really not the intelligence, but the behavior around how it sees itself. Largely in a social context. I mean, it's, you know, a lot of how it sees itself is about it knowing that I'm looking at it and behaving accordingly. but that's sort of what makes me think, well, there's a thing that's reflecting on itself in some way. Um, there's a thing that has some sense of itself as a distinct thing. And so it's when I see behavior like that I go, oh yeah, you're probably conscious. Rather than when I see anything intelligent. When I see intelligence, I'm like, damn, you're going to beat me in chess.
Yeah, I think I don't disagree with anything you just said. Really, I think we were using intelligence in a slightly different manner. I think it's, um, but I think it's good that you said all that, because like I think that's a good frame and for the question. But when I said intelligence, I mean more like an intelligence rather than like a measure of how intelligent the thing was.
Yeah.
But because I think like if you consider the Gestalt system of like me and a calculator or me and a pen and paper, like clearly this system is in some sense quite self-reflective, right? It's that reflection is clearly rooted in me in some sense, but like it's not. It is. It is. I am aware of the paper that I'm working through. I can read it back, and also like I can use the paper to do reflection that I couldn't do on myself, like journaling. Journaling is a whole thing. So I think like I guess like let's just test a claim. Like, do you agree that like me plus the external tool is meaningfully conscious in a way that is different from the way in which I am meaningfully conscious?
Yes, with the qualification that I think it depends somewhat on what you're doing with it. Because yeah, the example of journaling is like absolutely one that you should go for, because there you're you have access to yourself as a system. People being aware of how the language I'm using is so biased towards.
It's very hard to talk.
But whereas if we took, say, using a hammer, like I'm not saying that you become unconscious when you use a hammer, obviously not, particularly when you hit your thumb. But it's, and yes, obviously it changes the experience, because using a hammer is a very different experience from trying to hit things with your hands. But I'm not sure that it and yes, I guess if a system is, if you're really good at using a hammer, it becomes a part of you. Again, being influenced by the language. And I think there's something to that. Like it becomes reasonable to see it as a part of you in the same way that, to some degree, in the same way that your hand is a part of you. But I'm not sure that I want to say that it participates in consciousness. I mean, obviously you're conscious of it.
Mhm.
Um, but I guess I'm sort of resisting saying that, like, because you look out the window and you see a tree,
Mhm.
the tree is now sharing in the consciousness. I
Yeah.
mean, you're experiencing the tree for sure, but I would still, I think, want to say that the conscious bit is you and not the tree. And a tree is probably a good example, because the tree doesn't really get acted on, if it's outside the window. Um, Nothing really changes as far as the tree is concerned if you look at it.
Yeah, no, I think like the tree is certainly not a very active participant in consciousness. And I think I wouldn't I would use the word participating and not sharing quite deliberately, because I think participation in consciousness is intrinsically asymmetric in a lot of cases. Um, it's um, but I think like if the fact that journaling allows me to have reflection and thoughts that um, are in some sense like core constituents of consciousness, that like allowing self-reflection, like looking at a tree absolutely allows me opportunities for self-reflection that no, that I wouldn't have on my own. Like I think external random input is a really good and critical part of consciousness. I think like I could go, oh, that's a nice tree. I like trees. Oh, that reminds me of a time in which I was sitting under a tree. And so I think like the external world is a very active participant in our thought processes and our experiences of consciousness. And um, I um, as a side note, I would somewhat endorse the idea that trees are conscious in their own right. I don't think it's a very exciting form of consciousness, but I think like I would be willing to put forth an argument, but won't right now because it'd be a huge digression that like a tree is more conscious than an ant today, or at least about as conscious as an ant.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue too much against the tree being conscious,
Yeah,
because they're they're
yeah,
they're quite they're quite
yeah.
complex things.
Yeah. If you want to switch the example to a rock, I think
Uh, so,
it
so so I think we should switch the example to a rock,
mhm,
for that reason. Um, and okay, I do think, I think we probably both agree that journaling participates in the consciousness in a much more active way
mhm,
than the rock does.
absolutely.
Um, um, and I guess I would see it. I guess what I'm looking at there is I mean, you used the example of, you know, calculators allowing your
Mhm.
intelligence to do operations that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. Um, and I think that journaling allows you to do, I would say, operations in consciousness
Mhm.
that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm going to go back to that sort of self-reflective idea, because the journaling participates in that by sort of, expanding the set of
Mhm.
things that you can have access to, which is, massively important if you're doing a conscious operation,
Mhm.
or doing a self-reflective operation. Um, And so because sort of it's part of the system, like
Mhm.
in the same way that the RAM in a computer is part
Yeah.
of the computer system.
How
And
about a
so for
page of a book? Sorry, God.
no, go on.
How about a page of a book? Because I frequently use books as a source of random input to my journaling, and I definitely find it qualitatively changes the experience um, of the self-reflection that results from the journaling. Or a tarot deck is another example of like external randomness that is doing nothing other
Well,
than like like a draw a tarot card or something, or
yeah, yeah.
roll a dice, and anything where like all that you're getting from the external world is stuff that's coming in, not coming out, but that is a source of randomness.
Yeah,
Um,
sure. So I wouldn't necessarily expect to be able to draw exceptionally clear lines
mhm,
around an entity that I thought was conscious.
mhm,
Um, I don't see why I should particularly expect that to
mhm,
be the case. Um, and so I'm sort of untroubled
mhm.
by having this boundary of consciousness that sort of, when I'm sat down and with a pen and paper
Mhm.
and journaling on it, suddenly includes the pen and paper, and then as soon
Yeah.
as I take the pen and paper away,
Mhm.
it's sort of retracted
Yeah.
back to a different boundary and so on. Um, so I think so when it comes to say, okay, what happens if you open a book at a
Mhm.
random page or read some fiction,
Mhm.
um, or draw a tarot card or whatever, you know, is that part of the conscious system? And like, yes, to some extent, see a rock.
Mhm. Mhm.
I mean, it's,
Yeah.
I mean, if you're navigating, for example, and there's a particularly striking rock, suddenly that becomes part of the system by which you orient yourself. Um, so I'm not against any of that,
Mhm.
but it's only in the situations where it becomes part of this system that is reflecting on itself,
Mhm.
looking at its own operations and so on, that I go, oh yeah, I'm happy to count that as consciousness. And where it's not doing that,
Mhm. Yeah.
unambiguously, I'm
Yeah.
quite happy to say,
I think like the the only thing we're possibly disagreeing with here is like the difference between zero and minuscule. Like I'm not like I think the thing I'm claiming is that like is also that like the boundary of consciousness is fuzzy. It's just that I'm claiming that it's so fuzzy that it never quite goes to zero, as long as it's like as long as you are looking at things that are actively in my awareness in some manner. Like I think um because I think also like a lot of things, um like if I look at a rock and it doesn't spark any thoughts, it hasn't really sparked much in the way of consciousness in my mind. But also, if I'm just sitting here, I'm not like for actively self-reflecting either, right? And I still think I'm pretty conscious. I mean, obviously, like I've done the don't think of a white elephant thing, so now I am. But but like most of the time, I'm not engaged in active self-reflection myself either, and I still think I am meaningfully conscious in those moments.
and that might be a point of potential disagreement,
Hmm.
because I'm not sure.
Hmm.
I'm, I mean, that's one of those. So here's a possibility, right?
Hmm.
99% of the time, I'm not conscious.
Hmm.
Um, occasionally I ask myself, am I conscious? And immediately the answer is yes.
Mhm.
Um, and if I ask myself, was I conscious 5 minutes ago? I go, oh, well, I had that qualia. But actually, at that point in time, I mean, there's an interesting, I guess what I'm kind of coming to is something like, you know, 5 minutes ago, some random time when I wasn't
Mhm.
particularly engaged in any conscious thought. Um, and I asked myself, was I conscious at that time? At that point, I can kind of use my memory,
Mhm.
you know, because I still remember, you know, making a cup of tea or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, I can use my memory and go, oh, well, I was making a cup of tea. And at that point, the memory has sort of participated in
Mhm.
the conscious self-reflective activity in the same way that the piece of paper that I'm journaling on
Mhm.
has is participating in it sort of sporadically and
Mhm.
you know when I'm actually engaged in that activity. I guess that's the
Yeah.
argument that I'm sort of implicitly making here, not with a whole lot
Yeah.
of confidence.
Yeah. No, and I think there's a disagreement, there's a potential disagreement here, which I think is both like legitimate and probably more about how the word conscious should be used than necessarily a disagreement of on facts, about whether something that is not currently doing consciousness but could be like provoked into doing so at the moment it became at the first moment it became necessary, like whether you consider that conscious or not.
Mm,
And I think I would think of like consciousness as like the active potential for doing consciousness, for doing conscious activity or something like that.
mm,
Um, so I understand the thing being pointed at. I think when, like for example, people often say they're not conscious while driving, and I think what they mean by that is that they're in flow state. And I think thinking of flow state as an unconscious activity is, it's not wrong, in that like it's essentially like it is a state in which you're getting the introspective bits out of the way.
mm.
Um, but I'm not sure I want to. I'm not sure I want to make like the current ability, the current active process of introspection identical with the question of like, is this conscious? Um,
I think at the very least you'd run into some quite interesting problems there because I mean, like I don't know for sure, but there's every possibility that um, thinking is discrete in some way.
mhm.
Um, you know, so is the how do you sort of count the say moments between thoughts or something like that?
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I think that's probably correct that you don't want to that you'd want it to be sort of about the potential rather than the
Mhm.
actual act because the actual act is so difficult I think to pin down.
Mhm.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
um, does that quite get us to panpsychism?
It doesn't quite, but um, I think like it, so I haven't covered like the other half of my argument,
Oh,
which is essentially like this is the extended cognition half of my argument. The other half is like the group cognition half, which is that groups are conscious entities meaningfully in their own right. Which I think I'll mostly just like cite a great paper about this because it's really fun. Which is the title of the paper is um, if materialism is true, the United States is probably conscious. Um, and essentially, what it first of all does like a bunch of sort of interesting sci-fi thought experiments about like dividing and combining consciousness that I think we can mostly skip here. But then it essentially argues that the the United States exhibits behavior and intelligence that is like at least as responsive to external stimuli and to the world as that of, say, a rabbit. And so if we think a rabbit is conscious based on our observations of it, and if we accept like the materialism arguments that like combining and splitting consciousnesses are fine, then like we don't have much better evidence for concluding that a rabbit is conscious than we do that for concluding the United States is conscious. And it's a very high level summary of a good paper. I can try to defend the claims if you would like me to. But
hmm. Like, I guess I'm sort of default a little bit skeptical about claims about group consciousness like that.
mhm,
At least in some cases, because I think that's all someone has done is sort of shove a bunch of people together and sort of go, well, they talk about themselves, so there must be a group consciousness
yeah.
as well. And I'm like, maybe. Um, but also I don't rule it out
Mhm,
because like I'm really not ruling out any sort of, I'm not doing any sort of, well, brains are biologically conscious
mhm,
on account of some biological thing and computers can't be or anything like that. I'm totally happy to accept
yeah.
that there are conscious computers in theory.
Mhm,
Um, but I would, and I sort of take the point that the US does sort of self-reflect on itself in some way, as in actions within a country seem to affect the ongoing behavior of a country.
mhm,
Um, but I think I'm a bit agnostic about whether that, like, which specific self-reflective operations count as conscious
mhm,
and whether the specific self-reflective operations that a country can be said to do
mhm,
look like consciousness, that I would sort of accept as consciousness.
mhm.
I'm not quite sure about that question.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think one thing, so I think it's reasonable to say that if you live in the US, then the US is participating in your consciousness to a much greater degree than like a passing rock is, arguably to a much greater degree than like a journal is, for example. Like I think there you are very much in feedback with the country, and the country is like responsible for a great deal of what goes on in your head, and you are able to reflect on that. So I think like if you want to make the ability for self-reflection key to um, consciousness of the entity. Like the US has like a couple 100 million abilities for self-reflection in this regard. And so I think like, I admit most of those couple 100 million people do not seem very good at introspection, but that's a separate issue. But yeah, I think like, I think I do recommend the paper. It's very readable and mostly includes like lots of weird thought experiments about aliens. But yeah, I think yeah, I don't know. I'm also slightly running out of steam. So anyway, I think like the short version of my panpsychist claims based on this is that like consciousness is a participatory thing, and like everything participates in our consciousness to some degree, even if it's not very active in doing so, because that because that potential is still there. The other people can participate in it in the same way that like an object can. And that often, like, because of the way groups combine, it is useful to think of groups of conscious entities in their own right. And so I think many things that we would not normally regard as consciousness are usefully thought as manifestations of it. And it's and everything that we interact with to some degree is participate. I've already said it. I'm sorry. I'm getting to the point where I'm tired, but
that's cool. No, I think we're sort of not far off agreeing. I think we might have some sort of boundary questions about. I think actually possibly some somewhat fundamentalish questions. I'm not quite sure to what extent you agree with my sort of framing of, well, consciousness is something that's self-reflective. And I'm not even quite sure to what extent I agree with it either.
I think I consider your position reasonable, but haven't formed a strong enough opinion on like a strict definition of consciousness. Like certainly I've heard similar positions before, and I think like it's as good a definition as any. I just don't currently know how to choose amongst the definitions.
Yeah. So I think I think there are probably a whole bunch of interesting, like, with a bit of thought, I think we could probably come up with a whole bunch of interesting thought experiments that it might be interesting for us to think about, and we might have different approaches to them, which might be interesting. But it actually sounds like a lot of this, we've been kind of in agreement on a lot of this stuff, which does that make me a panpsychist? I guess I wonder whether the basic disagreement is what counts as panpsychism.
Yeah, and to be clear, like I am at most a weird sort of panpsychist who the other panpsychists would also disagree with as much as the non-panpsychists would. I think it's I don't think that electrons have qualia, for example.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe that's a subject for a future conversation. What exactly do you think panpsychism is? But yeah, that was
reading Stanford Encyclopedia.
Yeah. But that was a really cool conversation.
Cool. Yes, no, thank you, Colin. I enjoyed that a lot.
Likewise. Thank you very much.